Ezra Levant here from Rebel News. I feel like, oh, thanks very much. Thanks, Mom. I feel like between the QCJO, Qualified Canadian Journalism Organization license, and the de-ranking powers in these bills, I feel like it's a very personal bill to me, because we were denied that accreditation, and we're going to be downranked, and it's going to de facto ban us. It'll hide us, but of course the government will say we didn't ban anybody. Just made it impossible to find us. I think that it's going to be a brilliant way to silence dissident and contrarian voices. I have a question particularly for the Meta and the rep and the senator, and maybe you want to tell me in a different forum than this, but I see this as an existential threat to Rebel News, and it may be that for other dissident voices. I still have some hope for the federal court, which has twice now allowed us to overcome government censorship in the case of the leaders' debates where we were banned, and that was overturned by the courts. Is there a particular legal focus? Is there a particular provision of these laws or a policy? What would you say would be the best way to challenge these in court if they pass, as I expect they will? You can tell me now, or if there's a different form you want to tell me, I'd be genuinely grateful for the advice, because I think we have to sue, because if we don't, I think we're going to be put out of business.
You want to go first?
Yeah, I don't know if I can, let me think a little bit more, Ezra, about the legal angle. I could just tell you from Meta's perspective, this is sort of what I was speaking to earlier. If we're removing all news content, that will include, of course, Rebel News content. Now, we've done an analysis, and on average, we're driving about 13% of publishers' traffic to them. So that's not insignificant, but it's also not existential. It may be a little bit more for you, it may be a little bit less. We could talk about that. But 13% is not something, hopefully, that news publishers cannot replace by some other means. But yeah, look, I understand for some publishers, particularly smaller publishers, it's a little bit more than that, and so the impact of news removal is going to be more serious. But for us, look, we're being asked by the government to pay, $300+ million for this news content. It's not a revenue generator for us. We don't make any money off it. And so if we're asked to pay for it, it just makes no sense for us to carry it. And that's as simple as it gets. So, let's talk about your situation in particular, but from our perspective, this traffic should be replaceable by publishers, depending on how much traffic we're sending to them, but on average, it's about 13%. Yeah.
Senator? Look, there's definitely going to be charter challenges to this bill. To both of them, but particularly C11, just on the freedom of speech perspective alone. I'm not a lawyer by training, so I don't know the details of it. I've seen some briefs. We're fighting the nuts and bolts right now of the legislation, but there are a number of briefs from a number of constitutional lawyers that I'm sure they wouldn't mind being shared. On this particular issue. I do agree with you, this is an existential problem. We have a government that wants to choose what is legitimate news and what is illegitimate news. And we know this as conservatives, but hopefully Canadians are starting to wake up to the fact that this is a government that's not interested in governing. This is a government that's interested in just perpetuating their narrative and their propaganda. They operate like that. And if today's narrative isn't working, they switch the narrative the next day and they try to peddle that narrative. This is how they work. This is a government, the day they acquired power, they named a government leader in the Senate, which by the Constitution and the rule of law, the government has to name a government leader in the Senate to represent the government. We're a two-chamber parliament. So he received Peter Harder, Senator Harder, who was chair of the Trudeau transition team, got appointed to the Senate. He received his appointment as government leader, and ever since then, they've been calling the government leader in the Senate the government representative. Their government whip, they call him the liaison. The Liberals are masters at false speak. And they try to create, you criticize the liberal government in the Senate, you're a partisan, terrible senator appointed by Stephen Harper. You say good things about the government and Prime Minister Trudeau. You're not a liberal appointed senator who's saying good things about the government. You're an independent senator. Colleagues, in the Westminster parliamentary system, when you're an independent parliamentarian, you're not affiliated with any group or any party. So, not to mention the fact that in politics, everyone, you have to think it's a moral obligation to take a position on issues. So the problem we have here is that the government wants to determine your news outlet is not as worthy as the previous news outlet. Last week I asked the government leader in the Senate, he can call himself what he wants, but I call him the government leader, a question leading from a news story from Globe and Mail. I think most liberals consider the Globe and Mail a legitimate, they consider it a legitimate news outlet, which it is. I asked the question and the government leader didn't like the question or what a source was saying through a journalist in the Globe and Mail. So the response of the government leader was, well, Senator, how could you take seriously an anonymous source from just some journalistic newspaper? So they pick and choose when something has authority and when it doesn't, when it's radical or when it's moderate, when it's partisan, when it's acceptable. And this is so dangerous, but it's part and parcel of who Justin Trudeau is as a politician and as a prime minister, and it is really an anathema to democracy and to this country.
We have time for one more question.